There is a kind of fear that has no name. It is not the fear of a noise in the dark, or the fear of losing something you love. It is the fear of waking up on an ordinary morning, looking in the mirror, and knowing, with absolute certainty, that someone has already figured out who you really are, and that they are simply waiting for the right moment to knock on your door. Oleg Gordievsky lived with that fear for 11 years. Every day, every meeting, every handshake with a KGB colleague, any one of those moments could have been the last. And yet he went to work, signed reports, smiled for the cameras, raised his glass of vodka to the Soviet comrades he was, in secret, handing over to the British one by one. 11 years, the most successful double agent of the Cold War, a man who lived so deeply inside two identities at the same time that historians still debate, to this day, which one was real. But what you're about to hear is not just the story of a spy, it is the story of an escape that was designed never to be needed, one that used a grocery bag, a Mars bar, and the trunk of a diplomatic car to save a man's life, while the KGB stood meters away, with trained dogs, heat detectors, and orders to bring the traitor back alive or dead. And the detail that will stay with you when this is over. The thing that stopped the KGB from finding him in that trunk was not technology, not military strategy, not some sophisticated trick of the trade. It was a dirty diaper. But we will get there. Before we go back to the beginning, one thing you need to know. The CIA had a code name for him, TICKLE. For years, American intelligence received his reports without knowing who he was, where he was, or how the British had managed to get someone that deep inside the KGB. What he passed on changed the way the Reagan administration thought about the Soviet Union. It altered American nuclear policy. It helped prevent what historians believe came dangerously close to an accidental Third World War. And it was handed over, in secret, by a man the British refused to name, even to their closest ally. Washington only found out who he really was when it was almost too late. This is that story. Let us start where everything starts, not in 1985, when the world learned that something had happened, but much earlier, when a young Soviet officer watched for the first time the true face of the system he served. August 1968, Prague, Czechoslovakia. The Prague Spring had lasted months, a brave, perhaps naive attempt to build a socialism with a human face, more open, more free, within the limits of the Soviet bloc. Czech leader Alexander Dubček believed it was possible to reform the system from within. The world watched with a cautious, almost restrained hope, the kind people reach for when they do not want to be too hurt if it goes wrong. Then the Soviet tanks crossed the border. 200,000 soldiers, 2,000 tanks, in a single night, without a declaration of war, without warning. Operation Danube, the bureaucratic name Moscow gave to the crushing of a country that had dared to want something different. Oleg Gordievsky was in Moscow that day. He was 30 years old, a promising KGB officer, the son of a Soviet security veteran. His father had served in the NKVD, Stalin's secret police, and had taken part in the Great Terror, the purges that swept hundreds of thousands of people away in the late 1930s. Gordievsky had been raised inside the system, shaped by the system, taught to believe the system was just, necessary, inevitable. But when the images came, Czechoslovak students standing in front of tanks, bodies on the streets of a European capital, the silence that followed, something broke inside him in a way that could not be repaired. He never spoke about that moment to anyone, not immediately, not for years. It was the kind of thought that, in the Soviet Union of 1968, could get you killed just for having it. But the seed had been planted. In truth, the process had started even earlier, in 1961, when he was posted to East Germany and watched the wall being built. Gordievsky was a man who read, who thought, who listened to Western classical music, and felt that the world beyond the Iron Curtain held something the other side had lost, or perhaps never had. The crushing of Prague was not the beginning. It was the point of no return. The transformation came in stages, as almost all the great decisions of a life do. It was not a revelation. It was erosion. Every time he saw the Soviet system lie, to its own people, to the world, to itself, another layer fell away. My decision is not the result of irresponsibility or instability of character, he would write years later in a letter to the head of MI6. It has been preceded by a long spiritual struggle and by agonizing emotion. That struggle lasted until 1974. It was in Copenhagen, during his second posting to Denmark, that Gordievsky made the most dangerous decision of his life. And it did not happen dramatically. Danish intelligence had noticed during Gordievsky's first posting years earlier that this Soviet officer had something different about him. A curiosity about the Western world that went beyond the professional. A way of looking at things that suggested a man in deep internal conflict. When he returned for a second posting, the Danes tipped off British MI6. What followed was a series of seemingly accidental encounters, including one at a badminton court, where the local MI6 station chief and Gordievsky developed what would have appeared to any outside observer as a simple sporting friendship between two men who enjoyed the game. It was not. It was a careful courtship, conducted with the patience that only highly trained people, or deeply motivated ones, can sustain. The British were vetting. Gordievsky was, in his own way, signaling. Two men who wanted the same thing but needed absolute certainty before saying anything out loud. In 1974, the conversation happened. The British suspected a trap, naturally. The KGB loved deception operations in which a supposed double agent infiltrated a Western network to expose its members. Gordievsky was tested, assessed, and verified. But he was real. Inexplicably, dangerously, miraculously real. And so began one of the most extraordinary relationships in the history of espionage. A senior KGB officer, with growing access to some of the Soviet Union's most closely guarded secrets, working in silence for British intelligence, of his own free will, driven by ideology, not money. Simply because he had decided he was on the wrong side of history and wanted to fix it in the only way he knew how. He would do this for 11 years. And the intelligence he produced would reach the highest levels of two governments, one of which had no idea he even existed. What he handed over in those years was not just information. It was, in the most literal sense, the difference between peace and annihilation. In the years that followed, Gordievsky delivered to MI6 a steady stream of intelligence that would literally alter the course of the Cold War. He revealed the names of KGB agents embedded in British political organizations. He exposed Soviet recruitment methods across the United Kingdom. He revealed priority targets across Western Europe. The British did not disclose his identity even to the Americans. The CIA received the intelligence, but not the source, whom they referred to internally only as TICKLE. But what made British analysts lose sleep, in the best possible way, was when Gordievsky began explaining how the Kremlin actually thought. Not what the Soviets said publicly. What they genuinely believed in closed sessions, in internal reports, in the fears they would never admit to the world. And what they found was terrifying. In 1983, the Soviet intelligence operation known as Ryan, a Russian acronym for nuclear missile attack, was in full swing. The Kremlin had reached the paranoid conclusion that the United States was preparing a surprise nuclear first strike against the Soviet Union. The KGB and the GRU, military intelligence, were on maximum alert, monitoring every signal that the West might be readying an attack. When in November of that year NATO conducted the military exercise Able Archer 83, a simulation of conflict escalation up to the use of nuclear weapons, the Soviets came close to believing it was real. They nearly pressed the button. Gordievsky was the one who warned the British about the depth of Soviet panic over Able Archer. The British passed the intelligence to the Americans. The Reagan administration, which until then had not grasped the full extent of the Kremlin's paranoia, was genuinely shocked. And they changed course, using less aggressive language, signaling their defensive intentions more clearly. One man, passing information through a secret channel, may have prevented an accidental nuclear war. It is impossible to prove. It is impossible to disprove. But historians who have studied the period, including those with access to declassified files decades later, believe it is possible. That in the autumn of 1983, humanity came very close to a precipice it never knew it was crossing, and that Gordievsky was part of the reason it did not fall. By 1984, he had become KGB station chief in London, the highest-ranking Soviet intelligence officer on British soil. and he remained in total secrecy the most valuable asset MI6 possessed. When Margaret Thatcher needed to prepare for her first meeting with Mikhail Gorbachev, it was Gordievsky who, in essence, wrote the briefings for both sides. What kind of man Gorbachev was, what he valued, how to speak with him. The warm relationship that developed between Thatcher and Gorbachev, which many historians consider essential to the thaw that preceded the end of the Cold War, has, hidden in its margins, the silhouette of a man who could never have his name in that story. He was, by every measure, at the peak of what a double agent could achieve, trusted by both sides, shaping history from inside the machine. And then, in 1985, one man in Virginia made a phone call that destroyed everything. There was a man at CIA headquarters in Langley who had recently made one of the most monstrous decisions in the history of American intelligence. Aldrich Ames was a senior analyst, a specialist in Soviet operations. He had access to virtually every asset the CIA ran inside the Soviet Union. He had debts. He had a lifestyle his salary could not support. And he had apparently a conscience that had gone silent in a way no psychologist could adequately explain. In April 1985, Ames walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington and offered his services, in exchange for money, for the first installment of a fortune that would reach more than $4 million over the years that followed. What he handed over was a list of virtually every Soviet asset working for the West. Names, code names, methods. Gordievsky's name was on it. The CIA, frustrated by years of receiving intelligence from an unidentified British source, had quietly concluded that source was Gordievsky. That conclusion, kept from the British and noted only in restricted internal files, had reached Ames's hands, and Ames passed it to the KGB. The KGB did not act immediately. They watched, they monitored. They waited to see if there was more to harvest before closing the trap. Then they sent a telegram to London. Gordievsky was being summoned to Moscow. For a promotion, MI6 warned him. They gave him a choice: stay in London, abandon his cover, start a new life, or go back and play out the hand. Gordievsky chose to go back, because not going back would be an immediate signal of guilt. Because a trained spy sometimes believes, even when he should not, that there is one more door he can walk through. On May 19, 1985, he landed in Moscow. What waited for him was not a promotion ceremony. He was taken to a KGB safe house on the outskirts of the city. There he was interrogated for 5 hours, not with shouting or explicit threats. The KGB was more refined than that. They used substances that induced states of disinhibition, of vulnerability, of enough confusion that truths could slip out without the person realizing they were saying more than they should. Gordievsky was drugged. The interrogation moved between oblique questions about London, about contacts, about certain meetings, certain people. Gordievsky did not confess. He had spent 11 years preparing for exactly this moment. But the KGB still lacked hard proof. So they did something that seemed generous, but was a trap with a timer running. They let him go, allowed him to go home, but made it clear he would never be assigned overseas again, that he was effectively under permanent surveillance, that it was over. It was a sentence without a date, an indefinitely postponed execution, suspended while the KGB waited for him to make a mistake. Gordievsky walked out of that room knowing he had weeks, maybe days, and there was only one way out. The British had prepared for this moment years earlier. They hoped it would never be needed. They were wrong. Every Tuesday at precisely 7:24 in the morning, an MI6 officer would pass a specific street near the Kutuzovsky Prospect, one of Moscow's main boulevards where diplomats and foreigners lived, which made the presence of Westerners unremarkable. If Gordievsky was standing outside a bakery on that street at that time, holding a red plastic bag from the British supermarket chain Safeway, the signal was active. The MI6 officer who saw the signal would walk past without stopping, without direct eye contact, and keep moving. Gordievsky would stay in place. Then a second agent would appear, carrying a green Harrods bag and biting into a Mars bar as his eyes crossed Gordievsky's for the briefest possible moment. No words. No physical contact. No paper. Neither of them could even slow their pace. It is the kind of protocol that makes you understand viscerally why espionage is an art and not merely a profession. Because the art is precisely there, hiding a life-or-death message inside the most ordinary thing in the world. A man with a grocery bag, another eating chocolate in the street. On the morning of July 17, 1985, Gordievsky managed briefly to slip his KGB surveillance. He had a narrow window. He went to the bakery. He was there, at 7:24, with the Safeway bag. The first MI6 officer passed, saw the signal, kept walking. Minutes later, the second agent appeared, green Harrods bag, Mars bar, eyes crossing his for exactly half a second. 30 minutes after that, the agent called London. Operation PIMLICO was active. Gordievsky could not flee immediately. A sudden departure would be an instant signal of guilt. So he did what a man trained to live in permanent performance does. He kept to his routine, went home, went to work, attended meetings. But he was calculating every variable: the Soviet border, the guards. What would happen if he were stopped, and what would happen to the family he would leave behind? That is the detail spy films rarely capture honestly. Gordievsky had a wife, Layla, and 2 young daughters. He could not warn them, could not explain, could not say goodbye. Any contact increased the risk of compromising the operation. In the Soviet Union, when a traitor fled, the family paid part of the price. Interrogations, job loss, surveillance, social isolation, collective punishment as an instrument of deterrence. Think about what that means in human terms. His daughters were young children. They would wake up one morning and their father would be gone. No explanation, no letter, no farewell. And everything that followed, the KGB officers at the door, the whispers at school, the mother who lost her job, the name that became a word people said quietly and then stopped saying, all of that would fall on them. Children who had done nothing, who understood nothing, who simply went to sleep one night with a father and woke up without one. Gordievsky knew this. He had calculated it before activating the signal. It was the impossible equation at the center of every story like this one. One man's freedom purchased with the suffering of people who never got to vote on the price. On a Saturday morning, he picked up a small backpack, the kind a runner would take to a long training session because he was a marathon runner and that was his cover. He left the house as if going to exercise. He did not look back. Before leaving Moscow, he made one phone call. To a former KGB colleague on a line almost certainly being monitored. He asked whether the friend remembered a short story by Somerset Maugham called Mr. Harrington's Washing. The friend said he did. It was a private joke, nearly suicidal in its audacity. Maugham had himself been a British intelligence officer, and that story involved an escape from revolutionary Russia, crossing the border into Finland. Gordievsky said afterward, "I knew the KGB was not clever enough to work it out." He took the subway, then a train, 836 kilometers north toward Leningrad, today's St. Petersburg, where the plan called for a meeting point on a road outside the city, close to the Finnish border. Throughout the entire journey, anyone who looked at him would have seen a middle-aged man in good shape carrying a small backpack, ordinariness as armor, the oldest trick in the trade. While Gordievsky was on that train, a communication crisis in London nearly derailed everything. MI6 needed authorization from Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher to execute the operation, and Thatcher was at Balmoral, visiting the Queen. The phone lines were tied up. For nearly 20 minutes, intelligence officers tried to get through while the clock ran. The reason for the delay, which only became known years later. The Queen was trying to borrow her mother's VCR to watch an episode of Dad's Army, a beloved British comedy series. The line was busy. The operation that might change the course of the Cold War was nearly delayed because the Queen of England wanted to watch television. Authorization finally came through. 2 MI6 cars left Helsinki and crossed into Soviet territory on British diplomatic plates. Inside were 2 intelligence officers, Raymond Asquith, the MI6 Moscow station chief, and his deputy Andrew Gibbs, along with their wives and Asquith's 15-month-old daughter. The cover, a routine family journey, with children, exactly the kind of thing border guards saw regularly from Western diplomats. What the cover did not account for was that a KGB surveillance car attached itself to the 2 British vehicles the moment they left Leningrad, not hiding, but making certain it was seen. A silent message. We know what you are doing. The planned pickup with Gordievsky was compromised for hours. Gordievsky, meanwhile, was waiting in a pine forest at the edge of the road, being eaten by mosquitoes in the July heat, with no way of knowing whether the British had been called off, captured, or were simply not coming. Exhausted and disoriented, bleeding from insect bites, he had started to think he had been abandoned. The cars arrived 15 minutes late, at 2:45 in the afternoon. There was a bend in the road that, for a brief interval, put the vehicles out of sight of the KGB surveillance car. The British needed perhaps 30 seconds inside that blind window. The cars accelerated into the curve. Stopped. Gordievsky ran from the tree line. He was pushed into the trunk. The cars moved again. The KGB vehicle appeared on the straight. There was no one at the roadside. 2 British diplomatic cars, nothing more. The cars continued toward the border. Inside the trunk, Gordievsky was folded into the position that anyone past 40 knows well, knees to the chest, spine protesting after 2 minutes. The MI6 team had placed a thermal aluminum blanket over him, a space blanket, designed to confuse the infrared heat detectors the Soviets used at border crossings to identify human bodies hidden in vehicles. If it worked, they were through. If it did not, everything was finished. No one knew for certain which way it would go. The whole time, Gordievsky said later, I kept thinking, what happens if someone opens the trunk? The car stopped at the first checkpoint, then the second. Documents presented, verified, returned. The cars moved on. The third checkpoint was the actual border. Soviet guards approached the cars, inspected documents, asked questions, then brought out the dogs, German shepherds trained to detect exactly the kind of thing hidden in that trunk. Animals that had been used before to find people in exactly this situation. The dogs circled the cars. One of them moved toward the trunk where Gordievsky was hidden. And then something happened that appeared in no espionage manual. The wife of one of the agents, identified in later accounts only by the pseudonym Caroline Ascot to protect her identity, was changing the diaper of Asquith's 15-month-old daughter. In what Ben McIntyre, who wrote the definitive book on the case, later described as a completely spontaneous move, she lay the child down directly on the trunk lid, with Gordievsky concealed beneath, and changed the soiled diaper right there, dropping it to the ground. The dog's nose was overwhelmed. The animal was pulled away by its handler before the search could be completed. At the same moment, the other agent's wife opened a packet of Golden Wonder cheese and onion crisps. The guards, preferring to keep their distance from the combined assault on their senses, stepped back from the vehicle more quickly than they otherwise would have. The guards waved the cars through, the barrier lifted, and Oleg Gordievsky, still folded in the dark, still controlling his breathing, still not knowing for certain whether he had made it, crossed the border between the Soviet Union and Finland. From inside the trunk, he could see nothing. He could only hear, and what he heard was the car radio changing. The loud pop music that had played for hours gave way to a piece of orchestral music that Gordievsky recognized immediately. Finlandia, by Jean Sibelius. The Finnish composer's symphonic poem, which had become a symbol of Finnish resistance to Russian domination, chosen by the British as the audio signal that they had crossed over. A message inside a message, with the quiet irony the British liked to tuck into intelligence operations. The trunk was opened. Gordievsky looked up. Blue sky, white clouds, pine trees. Thanks to the courage and ingenuity of my British friends, he said later, I had outwitted the entire might of the KGB. I was out. I was safe. I was free. British diplomat Michael Shipster called London. The luggage has arrived. It's all in order. Gordievsky was taken to Helsinki that day and then transported secretly to the United Kingdom. The KGB took time to publicly acknowledge what had happened, admitting that a senior officer had fled to the West meant admitting a catastrophic failure, both in security and in ideology. But Moscow knew, and Leila Gordievsky, who had not known she was married to a spy, was summoned by the KGB, interrogated repeatedly, and lost her job. The daughters grew up with their father's name tied to the word traitor, without fully understanding what that meant. He spent years trying to secure his family's release. It was not until 1991, 6 years after the escape, and only because the USSR was disintegrating, that he saw his daughters again. The separation had lasted their entire childhood and adolescence. The marriage to Leila did not survive, not because of any single dramatic rupture, but because 6 years of forced distance and a silence that could never be fully explained do not leave much room for rebuilding. Some things break in ways that reunion cannot fix. The question of who had betrayed him took nearly a decade to answer publicly. Aldrich Ames continued working for the KGB for 9 more years after compromising Gordievsky. At least 10 agents were executed as a direct result of his revelations. Dozens more had their lives destroyed. Ames bought a house with cash, changed cars multiple times, lived in a way that any counterintelligence analyst should have flagged immediately. No one flagged it, because Ames was respected, was senior, was someone the system had invested decades of trust in. He was arrested in 1994. He is serving a life sentence with no possibility of parole. The irony the historical record has carefully noted. The way Ames betrayed the CIA mirrors, in structure, exactly what Gordievsky had done to the KGB. An insider, unrestricted access, ideological motivation in one case, financial in the other. The same mechanism, opposite directions. The systems that hunt each other are always vulnerable to the same kind of fracture they use to attack their enemies. Gordievsky was tried in absentia in the Soviet Union in 1985 and sentenced to death for high treason. The sentence was never carried out. In 2007, Queen Elizabeth II appointed him a Companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George, a distinction reserved for exceptional service to the United Kingdom, in a ceremony at Buckingham Palace. Which means the man sentenced to death by the Soviet government received a British medal from the hands of the same monarch whose VCR had nearly delayed his escape by 20 minutes. History, when it decides to be ironic, does not do it halfway. Gordievsky passed away in March 2025 in Surrey, England, where he had lived for the 40 years since his escape. He was 86 years old. He died in his bed, in a country that had given him shelter when his own country wanted him dead. There was no poison, no suspicious circumstances, no final act of revenge from Moscow, which had spent 4 decades wishing otherwise. He simply died as a free man, which, given everything, was the one ending the KGB could never take from him. There is a question that historians, journalists, and ordinary people who discover Gordievsky's story always end up asking. Why? Not in the technical sense. The mechanics of betrayal, the logistics of double agency, the details of the escape. That part is comprehensible, documentable, narratable. The question is something else, the question that remains when all the facts have been laid out and the silence returns. Why would a man who had everything, career, family, prestige, security inside a system that rewarded loyalty, choose to risk absolutely everything, including his own life and the well-being of everyone he loved, to serve a cause that was not even his own country? The answer Gordievsky gave, in slightly different versions over the years, is always the same in its essence. I had arrived at the belief that democracy and the tolerance of humanity that follows from it represents the only road for my country. Those were the words of the letter he wrote to the head of MI6 in 1974 when he began collaborating. They are not the words of a man driven by resentment or greed or personal vendetta. They are the words of someone who had thought deeply and arrived at a conclusion that required him to act. You may disagree with the choice he made. You may look at the daughters who grew up without a father and the wife who faced years of humiliation and conclude that no cause justifies that cost. That would be a reasonable position, but it would also mean ignoring what happens when people like Gordievsky do not exist, when no one inside closed systems has the courage or the conviction to open a crack, when the tanks in Prague go unanswered, when the warning about Soviet nuclear paranoia never reaches Washington. When Able Archer 83 unfolds and no one in the West knows how close the world came. History does not reward those who stay quiet. Sometimes it does not even reward those who speak, but it is built by both, by silences and by fractures, by loyalties held and by loyalties broken at the exact moment they needed to be broken. Oleg Gordievsky broke his. In a trunk lined with an aluminum blanket, with Sibelius's Finlandia playing on the car radio and the smell of a dirty diaper overwhelming dogs trained by the most powerful state of the 20th century, He crossed a border that was, in every sense that mattered, far more than a line on a map. And on the other side, there was blue sky, white clouds, pine trees, and air that was, finally, only his.